Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So tonight, Grenfell residents are meeting the retired judge heading the inquiry into the disaster. More information is now being given out about how new permanent homes will be allocated, but many people are still angry and that their voices aren't being heard. There's a history to this, of course, not least at Kensington and Chelsea's tenant management organisation, which runs the borough's social housing. We have a major investigation tonight into the culture of cost-cutting and high fees. More on that in a moment. But first, Kami and Zarem is outside tonight's consultation meeting. Kami.
John, the meeting with the inquiry chairman, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, and local residents and survivors began with a minute's silence, which was fastidiously observed, but then, I'm afraid to say, once again, descended into acrimony. A lot of the people who were angry with angry things to say were, I'm afraid, faces that have said similar things on many occasions before. It's a cover-up, one woman shouted, before she was then shouted down by others who said, "We're here to listen. Let Sir Martin speak. We want to hear him. Let us not fight amongst ourselves, because we know who it is we have to fight."
Well, and it's not just Kensington and Chelsea, but it's councils across the country who've been forced to confront tower block safety.
That's right. Immediately after the Grenfell fire, there were fears that as many as 600 tower blocks around the country might be affected by potentially flammable cladding. That number was then revised down to around 200, 208, and obviously many councils are now trying to find out exactly what the problem is. There have been concerns voiced by some councils that they might not be able to afford to do the work. This afternoon, the Communities Secretary said if that was the case, local councils need to speak to central government.
What we've been very clear about from day one is that for any council, whether it's sort of Brent Council or any other council, that any work that they need to do to make their properties safe that's recommended by their fire and rescue authority, their local fire and rescue authority, they need to get on with it and do it. And we've said that if you cannot afford it, we will help you pay for it. We've made it absolutely clear.
So back to the inquiry in the terms of reference. As you may know, the deadline for consultation submissions was extended to the 4th of August. The chairman will then make his recommendations to the Prime Minister, but the first public hearings for the inquiry are unlikely to start until the middle or end of September.
Kami and Zarem. Well, now, the Grenfell fire has brought into focus the bodies running much of Britain's social housing. Tenant management organisations, or TMOs, Kensington and Chelsea TMO, which ran Grenfell Tower and was responsible for its refurbishment, is the biggest in Britain, with nearly 10,000 properties and thousands of tenants. TMOs, especially Kensington and Chelsea, have been criticised for outsourcing responsibility for housing from councils, for obscuring and complicating financial processes, and most of all, by tenants for not serving their interests. Our economics editor, Helia Ebrahimi, has been scouring the books and practices of Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, where she's discovered millions of pounds a year are absorbed in management fees and interest charges.
The two worlds of Kensington and Chelsea, the leafy streets of the UK's richest borough, but now looming over them, Grenfell. In the wake of the tragedy, there are questions about whether the disaster could have been prevented by the council and the tenant management organisation, the company that runs the borough's social housing. In a borough where open-air opera is subsidised by the council, residents complain of years of mismanagement, excessive fees and a culture of snobbery. In our investigation, we look at whether the TMO was up to the job and whether it was overpaid. We examine the cosy relationship with the council and the austerity measures that further squeeze social housing, as well as the sky-high interest payments demanded by Treasury. Did all these pressures together lay the path to Grenfell?
These organisations are falling apart. The people are not able to do the jobs they're meant to do. They quite often couldn't explain to you what fire regulations or building regulations are. You've got individual housing officers looking after 10 blocks. It's impossible.
In Kensington and Chelsea, the income from social housing is quite straightforward. They get £58 million in rent from tenants and from housing benefit. But what happens on the spending side? That's more complicated, because a lot of it seems to just float away. There's £14.5 million in management fees. Then there's £13 million that gets taken up by capital charges. That's mostly an interest bill. And what you're left with is just £19 million. That's just £1 in £3 spent on maintenance and repairs for social housing stock. Perhaps that's why David Keir's entire block had scaffolding standing idle for over a year. Now he tells his local MP he wants the TMO to be taken off the council's payroll.
We got a letter, the single letter, the only letter we got from the TMO, explaining to us that the painting and decorating company, the contractors, had gone bankrupt. And the scaffolding stayed up for over a year. So a lot of very, very annoyed residents who felt that the TMO simply weren't listening. TMO is not an accountable or transparent body. It really should be taken back into the council.
Emma Dent-Coad is Kensington's newly elected Labour MP, but she used to be on the board of the TMO and a local councillor at the borough.
The council is supposed to oversee the work of the TMO. The way they treat tenants is an absolute disgrace.
Just bumping into local residents, it doesn't take long for her to hear their worries.
But they don't really reflect the people that live in this part of Kensington. That's something I've noticed. They seem too far removed from how people live here.
She says the TMO's management was chaotic.
It was really, really dysfunctional. It was really appalling, actually. I mean, often the board meetings would end up in total disarray, to put it politely.
They're so bad at managing this property. Why are they still there?
Well, it's because they've been allowed to be there, and that's down to the council. The council has responsibility for that. It is their property, and their properties are being mismanaged by the TMO, and have been for many, many years. I saw a real disdain for people lower down the social orders. I never want to see that in the council again.
Do you think Grenfell could have been avoided?
Of course it could have been avoided. It could have been avoided. It should have been avoided, but it certainly was preventable.
There's also controversy over cost. In Kensington and Chelsea, the TMO fee alone is £10.8 million. But the council charges an extra £3.7 million against its housing income to effectively manage the TMO, taking the total to £14.5 million. That means that in Kensington and Chelsea, the management cost per social home is £1,536. But in nearby Camden, where there is no TMO, it costs £801 per social home. Of course, different councils inherit widely varying stock that make it hard to do a like-for-like comparison. But it seems there's no longer a national body keeping an eye on things. And what's the view over there that you're saying? Eamon McGoldrick represents the large management groups that look after council housing. You've gone from a situation where there was an overall body looking at TMOs nationally to one where there's no regulator.
There's certainly been a reduction in regulation, and I think we're also seeing
at the moment...
But there's
no regulator, is there?
The ultimate regulator is the democratic elected body, which is the council. Ultimately, if services aren't good and not delivered well, then it's through the ballot box and through democratic process.
Surely you must acknowledge that residents would think it's strange there's no national regulator.
Sometimes the Audit Commission, for example, with arm's length management organisations, did give a degree of comfort by doing an on-site inspection every 2 or 3 years, by doing an in-depth look at the organisation.
But why did that disappear?
Well, government, as part of their, I think it was a time when they thought there was a lot of quangos. Remember that thing, make these quangos toast? There was actually a drive by the coalition government to actually remove a lot of these quangos and inspection regimes.
In the aftermath of the Grenfell disaster, the TMO's chief executive, Robert Black, resigned amid questions about the responsibility for the fire and anger about his six-figure salary. The organisation says it has a 90% approval rating amongst its tenants, but legal papers show it's been dogged by controversies for almost a decade. In 2009, there were so many complaints by residents that an external legal expert was brought in to investigate the TMO. This document shows that there were 33 areas of concern, including a corporate governance breach where the TMO was instructed that board members should not abuse their position. The minutes of the TMO and the council show an emphasis on saving money and maximising rental income. In one of the many examples, in 2012 they planned £1 million of spending on Grenfell, but in the end only used £376,000. The following year, fire alarms, rewiring works and estate lighting have a combined underspend of £336,000. However, minutes also show pressure on raising rents from tenants, with a 2014 discussion about increasing an extra £7 million in rental income, a 27% hike over 5 years. The defenders would argue that this is prudent housekeeping. Those at the council, who were there at the meetings but didn't want to be filmed, told me that Kensington and Chelsea is not a scrimp and save council. They were simply responding to changes imposed by central government that meant they had less rent and less flexibility. According to this insider, they're a traditional and paternalistic council interested in protecting the poorest in society. The issue, they say, is that in 2015, everything was turned on its head.
We took difficult decisions
in his budget that year. George Osborne announced cuts to social rents of 1% a year. In real money, this small shift cost many councils hundreds of millions of pounds. According to the local government authority, which represents 350 councils, a £5.8 billion black hole emerged. The LGA says that as a direct result of housing money drying up, 120,540 more children and their families are now in temporary accommodation. For the borough, the Osborne changes have meant an £87 million black hole in the next 5 years. The pressure created by these policy shifts are being exaggerated by loan payments owed to Treasury. At Kensington and Chelsea, the interest in these debts is sometimes as high as almost 10%. These abstract numbers translate into real strains for the tenants who live here.
We know that we can't even get repairs and maintenance jobs done without threatening people with court action. So do you think that fire safety is going to be a priority for those people? It should be, but it isn't. And we find that is the case. It's way down the list. You have to complain, you have to threaten court action, you have to go to the press quite often to get the least thing done.
For Pat Mason, the problem starts with central government's obsession with deregulation.
And it's a systemic problem. If the government doesn't think it's important, why should these people? They'll just hire another lawyer or another consultant to prove that what you've just said is unsafe is safe. And that happens every day. You want a friendly consultant? I'll do the job for you. Give me 10 grand. You know, we need to get back to a prescriptive fire safety and building regulations. You want to build a building? This is exactly what you will do.
The TMO told us it is
cooperating fully with all investigations.
And it was
determined not to do anything that may get in the way of these investigations or delay the authorities from getting the answers and recommendations that mean these tragic events are never repeated.
Tonight, the council's new leader has told us they're working on a deal with central government to allow Kensington and Chelsea to keep more money from right-to-buy sales and the freedom to borrow extra money for housing. Perhaps some comfort for tenants then, if it's a recognition that a lot more needs to be done by local and central government for social housing.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Well, now, a short time ago, I spoke to Reg Kerr-Bell, a former chairman of the Chelsea and Kensington Tenancy Management Organisation. He resigned after his concerns about the way it was run were ignored. I asked him why he decided to leave.
I just felt that the company was starting to become uncontrollable by the board of directors. The control of the company was leaning more towards the executive team, and I felt that was unacceptable. Certainly my voice and the voice of other directors were systematically removed to the sidelines, and that was dangerous.
What was your voice saying?
Well, my voice was trying to keep in check the executive team, who seemed to be going off in a direction of their own and not following the guidelines of former chief executives, to ensure that, you know, we delivered a safe and viable process of management for the residents, and not take any reckless chances, which I felt were happening.
I mean, people are talking about meetings being absolute chaos and there being real conflict.
Meetings could descend into chaos, but generally these were sabotaged by people who were even on the board of directors, who maybe didn't like the chair of the board at the time and would deliberately sabotage meetings in order to create chaos.
But where was the council in all this?
The council had 4 seats on, when I was chairman, had 4 seats on the board of directors. That was all their influence on the TMO would be.
But they never called a halt and said, hang on a minute, we're going to get the council to wind this up. This isn't acceptable.
They can't.
Why not?
They can't wind up the TMO. They don't have the authority to.
Who could wind up the TMO?
It would take an act of parliament.
But you described this to some extent as if you were kind of sort of outside it, observing this horror show going on, in which the executives in particular were running away with the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, why didn't you go earlier and blow the whistle?
I went to the council and said, and we had several discussions with senior members of the council and I about my being unhappy with how things were going. You know, things are going too badly wrong. I foresee danger ahead.
But I'm wondering what these people who were going wrong, as you put it, and doing things that were wrong, I'm wondering, I mean, how could they get away with it? I mean...
They managed to ingratiate themselves into the council and weave their way into the council's favour.
But when you did go in 2013, did you blow the whistle then? Did you say, look, this is just unacceptable?
I did, yes.
And what was the reaction?
There wasn't one.
But I mean, that terrible image behind you of the burnt husk is the consequence of this total breakdown, smash-up of... And I'm wondering, what was their aim? What did they want to do? Why were they skimming money off? Why did they want to cut corners? What was the aim?
There was no need to cut corners on this building. The tragedy of Grenfell is that it was mismanaged, not only from the start of that project, but very early on, during the time that I was there, when the company started to head off in a different direction than what we were used to.
Given what's happened, I mean, do you have a clear conscience, or do you feel I should have done more?
I have a clear conscience. I was shouted down. I was drummed off the board because my opinions were quite strong in relation to what was going wrong.
Mr. Kerr-Bell, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, joining us now is Andy Bates from the National Federation of Tenant Management Organisations. Andy Bates, I know you say that this isn't a TMO, but it calls itself a TMO, and it appears to be a TMO.
Yeah, it's completely different to every other tenant-managed organisation in the country. One, because of its scale. So you said it's nearly 10,000 properties. Every other tenant management organisation in the country is between, the smallest is about 20, the largest is about, 1,500. The tenant-managed organisations are designed to be properly democratic, the exact opposite of what you've described in your report, so that local people are on the management Management Committee, they've got direct knowledge, they've got direct control, they take the big decisions that affect their lives, particularly around safety. So,
but did you ever hear of things going severely wrong with this particular organisation?
No, because we tend to be kind of very local, and we tend to kind of be thinking about our own problems.
But I mean, this is a shocking insight into something which completely fell to pieces and was incapable of doing the job, and people's lives were at stake and lost.
I think that, yes, which is obviously absolutely terrible. I think important thing to say is that Kensington and Chelsea is different to every other tenant-managed organisation because, without confusing people with acronyms, it's also a borough-wide arm's-length management organisation, which no other tenant-managed organisation is. Having said that, there is still the democratic control, because if Westminster had been concerned, sorry, if Kensington and Chelsea had been concerned about the performance of the Elmo, they could have first.
But they weren't, because as this gentleman told me, they were joined at the hip. There was no concern at all. I mean, they were sort of complicit with its complete failure.
Well, legal relationship is that if the council had concerns about the performance of the Elmo, initially they could have served a rectification notice, instructing the tenant-managed organisation where they needed to improve, and then ultimately they could have served a default notice.
But equally, if there were a regulator, your system would have found this, but there is no regulator. And you could say the council is the regulator, but if the council doesn't do it, how are these people protected?
Well, obviously, in this case, people were dreadfully let down, but the regulation has to be, I think, on the basis of democratic accountability. So the first line of responsibility lies with the local authority, and particularly the ward councillors, who are kind of out and about collecting this information. Well, I think, the other...
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time on it, but I mean, clearly something has to be done in regard to that particular outfit.
Yes.
Whatever else.
Of course.
But thank you very much for coming in.
Okay, thank you.
Jackie.